America's first serial killers. A true story. How could entire families vanish on the Kansas frontier without leaving a single trace? Why did travelers who set out with money, wagons, and hope disappear into silence? And what secret waited along the Osage Trail that turned dreams of a new life into terror? Stay with me, because this true story hides a mystery darker than anyone expected. Part 1. The Frontier Mystery. In the years after the Civil War, the Kansas frontier was a place of promise. Railroads were expanding, farms were being settled, and thousands of travelers passed along the Osage Trail, seeking new opportunities. But by the early 1870s, this same trail gained a darker reputation. People were vanishing. Men on horseback were reported leaving towns, never to be seen again. Families set out in wagons and failed to arrive at their destinations. Letters stopped. Entire households back east waited for news that never came. Some disappearances were explained away as outlaws, Indian raids, or bad weather. But when strong, well-armed men vanished without trace, doubt began to grow. The pattern was chilling. Too many disappearances centered on one stretch of road in Labette County. Travelers entered that section, but never exited. And yet, no bodies were found. No wagons, no horses, no weapons. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Neighbors whispered of curses and spirits. Others suspected organized gangs. But none of the usual signs of banditry were there. Belongings and money never reappeared on the black market. Tracks went nowhere. For lawmen, the lack of evidence made the cases nearly impossible to investigate. Still, rumors spread. Certain farms along the trail were noted for their oddness. Visitors passed through and were never heard from again. The fear grew so strong that some avoided the Osage Trail altogether, even if it meant weeks of detours. Those who continued took their lives in their hands. By 1872, the mystery had become too large to ignore. Travelers carried tales of men who stayed at a roadside inn but never checked out. Neighbors began to watch each other more closely, suspicion rising with every missing person. The frontier was supposed to be dangerous because of outlaws and storms, but now, people feared their own communities. What could make people vanish so completely? No gunshots, no robberies, no bodies, just silence. Each case deepened the fear. If this could happen to strong settlers, it could happen to anyone. The Kansas frontier held many dangers, but nothing compared to what investigators would soon uncover. Behind one family's farmstead lay the true answer to the mystery. And that answer was more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Part 2. The Bender family arrival. Among the scattered settlers of Labette County was a family calling themselves the Benders. They arrived in 1870, immigrants of German origin, and built a modest one-room cabin on the Osage Trail. At first glance, they looked like any other frontier household trying to survive. The family consisted of 4 members. John Bender, known as Old Bender, spoke little English and was described as rough and unfriendly. His wife, remembered as Mother Bender, was even harsher, often shouting at neighbors and claiming to possess mystical powers. Their son, John Jr., seemed slow-witted and laughed inappropriately at the wrong times. The daughter, Kate, was the opposite. Young, attractive, and outspoken, she promoted herself as a healer and spiritualist. She offered fortune-telling, claimed she could cure sickness, and preached unusual views about free love. The cabin itself was simple. One half served as a living space, while the other functioned as a small inn and store for weary travelers. A canvas sheet divided the room, concealing whatever the family did on the other side. To travelers, it appeared to be a welcoming stop for food, supplies, and rest. On the lonely trail, such places were rare and valuable. Yet the Benders never fully blended in. Neighbors found Old Bender hostile and Mother Bender frightening. John Jr.'s odd behavior disturbed people, and Kate, while charming to some, shocked the conservative settlers with her boldness. Still, travelers were often drawn to her confidence, and many stopped at the farm because of her reputation as a fortune-teller. The family's survival seemed secure. They grew crops, raised animals, and ran their inn. Unlike many struggling settlers, they appeared to have more than enough money and supplies. Quiet questions arose. How did they manage so well when others barely scraped by? The answers were vague, and most neighbors dismissed their unease. On the surface, The Benders were an ordinary immigrant family seeking prosperity. In truth, they had built something far more sinister. Their cabin was not just a place of shelter. It was the center of a deadly trap. The disappearances along the Osage Trail were no mystery of weather or bandits. The secret lay inside the Bender home, hidden behind the canvas sheet and beneath the cabin floor. And soon, the trapdoor would reveal the family's terrible secret. Part 3. The Trapdoor Secret. The Bender cabin was a trap disguised as a shelter. Its deadly secret began with a wooden table placed carefully near the dividing canvas. Travelers who stopped for a meal or conversation were always directed to sit in the chair with its back to the curtain. It looked like any other seat, but it was chosen for one reason. Behind the curtain, one of the Benders would wait silently. Usually it was old Bender or John Jr. when the traveler was distracted, often by Kate's questions or her fortune-telling. The killer would strike. A heavy hammer came down on the back of the guest's skull. The attack was quick, brutal, and almost always fatal. Beneath the chair was a trapdoor. Once the victim fell forward, stunned or dead, the Benders pulled the body down into the dark cellar. If the blow had not finished the job, the victim's throat was cut. Blood drained into the dirt floor, soaking the ground beneath the cabin. Later, the body would be dragged out and buried in the orchard behind the house. The process was simple but effective. The hammer silenced the victim. The trapdoor hid the body. The cellar contained the blood. And the orchard erased the evidence. Travelers vanished without a trace, leaving no clue behind. The Benders kept their belongings: money, horses, weapons, supplies, enough to live comfortably while others struggled. Some neighbors noticed strange odors near the property. The Benders explained it away as spoiled food or animal waste. Few questioned them further. On the frontier, bad smells were common, and people minded their own business. Others recalled seeing guests enter the home, but could not remember seeing them leave. Still, without proof, suspicion remained only gossip. The victims came in all forms: lone men traveling for business, families seeking land, settlers carrying cash. Some were buried so shallow that rains revealed bones. Others were hidden deep enough to stay undiscovered for years. The Benders had turned their home into a slaughterhouse and the Osage Trail into their hunting ground. The trapdoor was the key to the mystery of Kansas vanishings. It was also the detail that, once uncovered, exposed everything. But before discovery, it worked flawlessly, making the Benders' murders nearly invisible. Part 4. Suspicion builds. For years, travelers disappeared along the Osage Trail with no answers. At first, people blamed storms, outlaws, or accidents. But as the numbers grew, whispers began to focus on something closer. One particular farm where strangers often stopped, but rarely, seemed to continue. The Bender family had always been regarded with unease. Old Bender was unfriendly and muttered in German. Mother Bender was known for her temper and sharp tongue. John Jr. laughed at odd times, unsettling anyone near him. Kate, though charming to some, preached free love and claimed to speak with the dead, ideas that made her infamous in a conservative settlement. Together, they were tolerated but never fully trusted. As more men went missing, suspicions began to circle back to their cabin. Neighbors noted that the Benders always seemed to have money, animals, and supplies. This stood in contrast to most settlers, who struggled to survive. Some recalled seeing travelers arrive at the cabin, yet never remembered seeing them depart. Others noticed the orchard soil disturbed more often than seemed normal. Yet no one spoke openly. Accusing a neighbor on the frontier was dangerous. Without evidence, it risked feuds and retaliation. Law officers had little to investigate. There were no bodies, no stolen goods traced, no witnesses. All anyone had were uneasy feelings and rumors. That changed with the disappearance of George Newton Lonker and his young daughter. Unlike others, Lonker had strong ties to the community. When he and his child failed to arrive at their destination, concern turned into alarm. Friends began asking questions, and a search party was formed. Attention soon returned to the Bender farm. People remembered Lonker had traveled along the Osage Trail. The Bender place was one of the few stops in that stretch. If he had passed through, the family might have been among the last to see him. Fear now mixed with anger. Too many were gone, and patience had run out. The settlers could no longer ignore the possibility that the killers were not bandits or raiders, but neighbors. Suspicion turned into resolve. A decision was made. The Bender cabin would be searched, and what they found would confirm the darkest whispers. Part 5. The Grisly Discovery. In the spring of 1873, a search party rode to the Bender farm. They expected answers about George Newton Lonker and his daughter. What they found went far beyond a missing family. The farm was silent. The Benders were gone. Livestock wandered the property unfed. Supplies and belongings were left behind. It looked as if the family had fled in haste. Suspicion hardened into certainty. This was no ordinary disappearance. The men entered the cabin. At first glance, it was plain: a stove, table, chairs, and a canvas dividing the room. Then someone noticed dark stains on the floor near the table. Scraping revealed blood soaked into the wood. A rug was pulled back, exposing a trapdoor. When the trapdoor was lifted, a wave of stench filled the cabin. Lanterns revealed a cellar below. The dirt floor was drenched with dried blood. No bodies lay inside, but the signs of slaughter were undeniable. The whispers about the family were no longer rumor. The Benders had been killing in this very room. The search turned to the orchard. Freshly disturbed patches of earth caught attention. Shovels went in. The first grave uncovered was George Lonker. His skull was crushed, his throat slit. Beside him lay the body of his daughter. More graves followed. Victims included men traveling alone, women, and even children. Some were robbed of valuables. Others still had money in their pockets. In total, at least a dozen bodies were found. The orchard had been a graveyard all along. Neighbors who once walked past it now realized they had been steps away from horror. Each tree grew over the remains of people who vanished without trace. News spread quickly. Newspapers across the country carried the story, branding the Benders as America's first serial killer family. Crowds came to see the cabin, the cellar, the orchard. Some treated it as a grim curiosity, others as sacred ground for the dead. The grisly discovery shocked the nation. The frontier was already known for danger, but this crime revealed a deeper fear: that evil could hide not in outlaws, but in the neighbors who smiled at you and offered shelter. The killers, however, were nowhere to be found. And now, the hunt for the bloody Benders began. Part 6. The Vanishing Act. By the time the bodies were uncovered in the orchard, the Benders were gone. Their farm stood empty, animals left behind, food on the shelves, but the family had vanished without a trace. Neighbors believed they fled days before the search party arrived. Some claimed the family left in a wagon at night. Others swore they escaped on horseback. No one knew for certain, but one fact was clear: they had been tipped off or sensed suspicion closing in. Posses formed immediately. Men rode in every direction, searching roads, rivers, and remote trails. Rewards were offered. Reports trickled in from across the region. Sightings of the Benders in Missouri, in Texas, even as far as Mexico. But every lead turned cold. The vast frontier made pursuit almost hopeless. Families could vanish into wilderness towns with new names and never be questioned. Rumors flourished. Some said vigilantes caught them and killed them quietly, their bodies buried in secret. Others believed they lived long lives under false identities. From time to time, arrests were made, women or men accused of being Benders, but none were ever confirmed. In 1889, 2 women in Michigan were detained as the mother and daughter, yet conflicting testimony led to their release. The failure to capture them fueled fear and fascination. The community had uncovered the graves, seen the trapdoor, and proven the horror. But without a trial or execution, there was no closure. The killers remained shadows, haunting imagination. Why were they never caught? The answer lies in the times. The 1870s frontier lacked communication systems, centralized law enforcement, and consistent records. Families traveled under assumed names and blended easily into migrant streams. Photographs were rare, making recognition unreliable. Justice, even with the nation watching, slipped through the cracks. For those who had lived near them, the escape was unbearable. People recalled sharing meals, conversations, and visits with a family they later realized were murderers. Now those same killers were free, possibly watching from another town, starting again. The Benders' disappearance remains one of the greatest unsolved endings in American crime. The graves were found, the murders proven, yet the family who committed them dissolved into legend. And legend is where they would remain. Part 7. the legend and legacy. The Bloody Benders never stood trial. Their escape ensured the story would never have a clean ending. What remained was legend, half fact, half folklore, that spread across Kansas and beyond. The abandoned cabin became a place of grim fascination. Crowds visited the site, staring at the trapdoor and the orchard where graves had been dug. Some described an eerie silence around the property. Others claimed the land was cursed, that crops refused to grow properly, as if the earth itself remembered the blood it had absorbed. Stories about the family multiplied. Kate, the daughter, became the most infamous. Newspapers painted her as both beautiful and monstrous, the smiling lure who distracted victims before the hammer fell. Some insisted she practiced witchcraft, others called her a cold seductress. The truth mattered less than the myth. Rumors about the Benders' fate took on a life of their own. Some said vigilantes hanged them and buried the bodies in secret. Others believed the family scattered, living under new names in distant states. Sightings were reported across the country for decades, but none were ever proven. The absence of proof made the story stronger. Everyone could imagine the killers still alive, hiding in plain sight. The tale reshaped how people thought about the frontier. Dangers had always been expected from storms, outlaws, or raids. But the Benders revealed a darker threat. Evil hiding in neighbors who looked ordinary, who offered food and shelter with one hand while holding a weapon in the other. The frontier was not only wild, it was deceitful. Over time, the Benders became part of American folklore. Parents warned children not to trust strangers, citing the family with the trapdoor. Writers and historians retold the story, each adding new twists. Ghost stories grew around the orchard, with travelers claiming to see figures at night or hear cries from beneath the soil. The Bloody Benders left no graves of their own, no final chapter to close their story. That uncertainty is what keeps their tale alive. The bodies in the orchard proved their crimes. Their flight into the unknown gave them immortality. More than a century later, the Benders remain fixed in history, not just as killers, but as shadows on the American frontier.